Considering we got two more sequels after this, I guess you can say that three really isn't a crowd. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment in my Scream review series where I talk all the Scream movies in the lead up to my review of the new film. And today we're talking about Scream 3. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it or if you were planning on seeing it. And make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about Scream 3. This once again stars Neve Campbell as Sidney Prescott. While she and her friends visit the Hollywood set of Stab 3, the third film based on the Woodsboro murders, another Ghostface killer rises to terrorize them. So, as I've done previously with my reviews of older films, this will get into spoilers. So, if you haven't seen Scream 3 by now and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Wes Craven returns to direct this one, though unlike the first two movies, this is not written by Kevin Williamson, who was committed to other projects and couldn't return. But similar to Scream 2, he did have an outline ready to go when he auctioned off his screenplay for the first movie. This time around, the film's written by Aaron Kruger, who took the outline and completely disregarded it, mainly due to scrutiny at the time surrounding violence in movies, which was a huge topic of conversation at the time. And the idea was to avoid any further controversy, so a lot of the script was heavily altered, especially moving away a bit from the more violent aspects of the series and attempting to make it more comedic, which I guess is a big reason why we got that random cameo from Jay and Silent Bob.
Hey Connie, how's Maury? Dude, I think she likes me, man. See how she's looking at me?
But what resulted is a similar situation as Scream 2, where the movie was constantly getting rewritten, and sometimes pages weren't ready until the morning of shooting, and this became the most complicated of all the Scream productions. What didn't help either was that Kruger was not as familiar with the characters initially, and didn't have an active hand in developing them through Scream 1 and 2, which meant that, while uncredited, Wes Craven routinely had to get involved if Kruger went too far off their initial characterizations. But they made it through, though not with quite as quick of a turnaround as between 1 and 2, as this was released 3 years after 2, and the result is something a bit more hit and miss, and so far the only Scream movie with a rotten rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I don't think this is a bad movie, but it's certainly not as sharp as either of the first two films. There are things about it that certainly work, but I'd say it's not quite as consistent. The fact that Kevin Williamson did not return to write this, as well as many of his notes being disregarded, show heavily throughout this. The film is once again meta, with a lot of the movie centered around the production of the movie within a movie, Stab 3, and many of the actors playing the Stab 3 characters having a major part in this. However, there's not as much of that witty back and forth that would drive many of the other installments forward. A lot of the riffing on horror cliches and poking fun at the industry isn't as prevalent this time around. Now, it's not completely absent. There is a plot point how the killer is going after the actors based on how they die in the movie within the movie, but that's also not what drives each and every conversation forward. It plays more like a generic slasher movie, and a lot of the dialogue is stuff you'd see in all the other horror movies that the first two films would routinely riff on. And I mean, I know part of the joke at times would be characters still falling into the traps they thought they were so clever to avoid, but there was also a cutting edge to the chases and the characters trying to outsmart one another. Here, a lot of it felt more generic in nature, with them not thinking things through as much. Even in the opening scene, in which Cotton Weary, played again by Liev Schreiber, is the one on the receiving end of the Ghostface phone call, it's not as fun. It's not a poorly done opening. It's filled with some great tension as we see him racing to get back to his apartment while Ghostface toys both with him and his girlfriend. But unlike the other two openings, where the first one starts with a piece of movie trivia, while the other one shows Ghostface using public spaces to his advantage and showing off people's fascination with violence, the whole point of conflict driving this sequence forward is Ghostface just wanting to know where Sidney is. Cotton won't tell him, so he and his girlfriend get killed. Again, in terms of things like pacing and suspense, it works well enough. Craven does a nice job at putting us on the edge of our seat, especially because Cotton is a returning character, and it's usually not the norm for the opening of a Scream movie to focus on someone who's directly connected with the main events of the other movies. But when you compare a scene based on Where's Sidney Prescott to the excellent back and forth between Ghostface and Casey in the first movie, or the movie theater sequence in the second, it pales in comparison, even though I wouldn't call it bad necessarily. But it sets the tone for the rest of the movie. it becomes apparent quickly that this isn't as clever as either of the first two movies in terms of its setup and its dialogue. And there's also a new twist on the formula where Ghostface uses the voice changer to somehow perfectly imitate the voices of a number of main characters from Sidney to Dewey and so on. And while this is a good way of keeping things interesting, as it's a fun way to lure other characters in, for one thing, I'd love to know exactly how that was even possible, that Ghostface could capture all these characters' voices to have them come off like perfect imitations. And two, this also becomes a predictable plot point in and of itself. Because the way these would be set up would be that every time someone got a phone call and the character on the other end sounded almost calm and collected, telling them to meet them somewhere, it was always, and I mean always, a trap. Every time. Especially since we wouldn't cut away to that person on the other line, which made it all the more obvious.
Who is it? Who's there?
Christine? Hon, you alright?
Well, come back inside and stay with Jennifer. Something's happened.
I can't believe you said that. That makes me
Angry!
I don't know if this was an attempt at being tongue-in-cheek, like it was supposed to be on purpose that the audience kind of figured it would be a trap before the characters got there, but to me, it just drained the scene of all its tension because you knew exactly what was coming. Now, does this mean this movie's not fun whatsoever? No. There were a number of things about it that I definitely enjoyed. For one thing, the returning characters were great to see. Neve Campbell back as Sidney is once again a joy. She gives it 110% as she always does. She doesn't get quite as much to do here as she does in the other movies, and I'll come back to that in a second, but she's as compelling as always. I also liked how they gave her this little detail at the beginning where she works as a crisis counselor. I think it's a great progression for her character, who's now suffered having survived a serial killer boyfriend, then having to deal with the revenge of said boyfriend's mother, as well as seeing her new boyfriend among many of her friends killed in front of her. I thought this was a great way of seeing her trying to help others in some way who may not have exactly experienced what she did, but have gone through some sort of emotional trauma. And it's a way of showing her trying to move past her demons. And as always, she's great. David Arquette as Dewey was also a welcome return. Here he's the one who mostly leads the charge against Ghostface. We see him working as an advisor on Stab 3, and he takes a vested interest in this case, not only because this is another attempt at someone reviving the Woodsboro murders, but because he's linked so much to the production of this film and the people involved. And I think the way he's matured since the first movie, it makes him a much more interesting character. Even though I still like the first movie overall the best, I think his character has actually improved with each film. And even seeing Courtney Cox again as Gale isn't so bad here. Again, this is another character who I think has improved a bit as these movies have gone along as well. I really didn't care for her in the first movie, and she's okay in the second. I don't think her arc is as strong as Dewey's in this movie, as we see her at odds with, well, everyone again here, but she's not as openly mean to everyone here as she normally is. She doesn't suddenly become the most likable of all the characters, as we still see her butt heads with everyone, but she's not detestable the way I thought she initially was. And another standout in the cast is Parker Posey as Jennifer, who plays the fictional Gale in Stab 3. Major highlight of the movie for me. And when it comes to this movie increasing its comedic elements, it's most apparent in the handling of her character. Knowing Gale has survived these events multiple times and seeing her fellow cast members killed off, she begins following her everywhere she goes as a means to survive.
What the hell are you doing? Being Gale Weathers. What the hell are you doing?
I am Gale Weathers.
And she even tries channeling some of the aggressive energy Gale is known for, and because she's not an inherently mean-spirited character like Gale, it does lead to a lot of fun moments. I thought she was very funny, and I enjoyed every time she was on screen. So I was pretty upset when they killed her off, as I really thought she was going to make it to the end. And while the meta commentary isn't as strong here, there are some clever moments. Probably the most expertly done moment in my opinion is with Jenny McCarthy's character, who is one of the actresses in Stab 3, and she notes her frustration how her character is killed off second and only has one other scene. And while, like I said, the whole point of the killer's motivations is that each cast member is dying in order of how they did in Stab 3, what's interesting is when they kill her character off, she only has one other scene in the movie, which was a clever little moment thrown in there, and sees the essence of Scream shine through, where it's the movie acknowledging exactly what it is. On top of that, a plot point reveals that in Stab 3, there are 3 alternate endings, so they don't know who ultimately dies towards the end. And fun fact, the actual script for Scream 3 had 3 alternate endings. So again, that was pretty cool. And while not consistently as clever, it was at least funny, playing even further into its horror comedy aspects. The interactions among each of the characters felt more lighthearted in nature, characters were making jabs at one another, and I especially like Patrick Warburton, who played the security guard of one of the actors. And at times, there's even a campier element to some of the kills, with not everyone dying by just getting stabbed by Ghostface. There was one that actually kind of had me laughing a bit, where Ghostface blows up a house with one of the Stab 3 actors in it, and the way the scene's staged, along with the effects, it makes it look a little cheesy and dated, and whether or not it it was intentional for it to be cheesy, I don't know, but I did find it pretty funny for its over-the-top feel, especially given that it's usually not Ghostface's MO.
Whoever smells the...
And I didn't even mind the final reveal, where in a rare break from it being two killers, we find out that the Stab 3 director, Roman Bridger, played by Scott Foley, is the sole mastermind behind the killings. And we find out it's a revenge plot against Sidney, as he reveals he's her half-brother, and he was the mastermind behind the first movie's events. Plus, he couldn't stand the fame she was getting as a result of said events, and he hoped to ruin her life. Now, I mean, this isn't the greatest of the reveals, but considering all the killer reveals are meant to come out of nowhere, with characters showing us they're not who they say they are, and having these dense secret identities that get sprung on us at the very last second, I was totally fine with this, to be honest. I'd be hypocritical to say that this was contrived when others weren't. Plus, it was a nice way of tying everything back to the original movie, which was noted as being a trademark of trilogies by one of the characters early on. And again, given how some of the other reveals play out, the way this was explained, it didn't feel contrived. There are parts of it that I wish were explored better, given what we find out regarding Maureen Prescott's backstory, but if anything, considering Roman's a more prominent character throughout the movie than Mickey was in Scream 2, I'd argue he works a little better as being one of the killers, since we spent just a little more time with the character. He's by no means one of my favorite of the villains, it's not like he's one of the most interesting characters from early on or anything, but it works for what it is. Fun fact though, the original reveal of the third act was that Stu would still be alive, and he was the mastermind behind all this. But that got scrapped when Kruger rewrote a lot of the screenplay, mainly due to the concerns I mentioned at the top of this review, and I would have much rather liked to have seen that, as Stu's a much more interesting character in my opinion, but this was still fine for what it was. But I'd say just what ultimately holds this movie back from being anywhere on the same level as the previous two movies, or even 4, is that it's just not as clever this time around. There are hints of that Scream magic in there, but like I've said, those self-referential conversations aren't as strong. A lot of it plays like a generic slasher with only sporadic bursts of cleverness, held together by its likable lead characters. And it's also just not paced as well either. I'd say this is the only Scream movie where you feel that length of it. The main reason being that Sidney is kept mostly separated from the rest of the characters for the first 2/3 of the movie. The main reason being that Sidney is kept mostly separated from the rest of the characters for like a good part of the movie. Now they do cross paths at various points in the first 2 acts, but she remains kind of on her own for a good part of the film. So now you have 2 different storylines. One with Dewey and Gale in the Stab 3 cast, and then one with Sidney kind of sort of on her own, though occasionally meeting up with the other characters. In particular, the one she gets closest with is the detective on the case, Detective Kincaid, played by Patrick Dempsey. But by doing this, it just causes the movie to drag at certain points. The film's just not as interesting with some of these characters being kept apart for a good chunk of the movie, especially since Sidney is such an integral and engaging part of this series. And because of this increased focus on separate stories, it causes this film to go on a bit too long in certain sequences, where characters are off on their own, while other parts being rushed or feeling shoehorned in. Like the way it brings Sidney and Detective Kincaid back into the fold in the final act feels so jarring, because there's at one point during the film where they're off screen for such a long stretch. So when we go for so long without seeing them and then we suddenly cut back to them, especially right after such a tension-filled moment, it feels a little disjointed. The other sequence that especially feels shoehorned in is a sequence where Martha, played by Heather Matarazzo, who's the sister of Randy, played by Jamie Kennedy, randomly appears in the middle of the movie to give Sidney, Dewey, and Gale a tape that Randy just so happened to record right before he was killed in Scream 2, just so they can have someone explain the trilogy rules before she quickly disappears as well. While it was nice getting one final dose of Randy one more time, as he was my favorite of the supporting characters in the other 2 movies, and the scene itself is fun for what it is, as it brings back that spark of the first 2 movies.
And that giving up my virginity to Karen Kolchak at the video store was probably not a good idea.
Karen Kolchak.
Yes, Karen Kolchak.
Creepy Karen?
Shut up!
The way it's so suddenly introduced felt a little forced, if you ask me, and it sticks out like a sore thumb in the middle of this weirdly paced movie. In a way, it just feels so disconnected from everything else, and the way everyone else just immediately moves on afterwards, it's like they don't really take anything in that's said from this tape. And it kind of made me sad that Randy was killed off altogether, because he was one of the most fun aspects of these movies, and considering there's not a character like him in this movie, it just adds to the fact that this isn't as fun as either of the first 2. Scream 3 isn't a bad movie, but it's certainly a mixed bag. Kevin Williamson's absence is incredibly apparent, as the film just isn't as witty or clever as either of the first 2 movies. There are times some of that magic is there, but it's just not as consistent. It can be funny, and the cast all do a fine job, and I do like the way it connects everything, and if you're a hardcore fan of the series, you'll be able to appreciate it, but while it's not bad, it does drag a bit, and its script isn't as sharp, and it becomes something similar to what the first two films were riffing on. Scream 3 gets a 6 out of 10. So stay tuned. Next up will be my review of Scream 4. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see Scream 3, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this your least favorite of the franchise, or do you think it's a little better than everyone says it is? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.